Hello, it's Miss Knappenberger and Olive, back for Miss Kay and Olive's Favorite Tales. Today we're going to be talking about classics. Now, I know that when you hear the word classics, sometimes you might get stuck in this idea that classics are old and boring and slow, and why would we read that? When actually there's so much for classics to offer if you know where to look. So I'm going to give you a couple suggestions that I think you will enjoy despite the fact that they were all written more than 50 years ago, all things considered. So, yeah. Thank you, Boo-Boo. Oh, yeah. She's just so cute. I got distracted so easily. Okay, so I'm going to start with Anne of Green Gables. I love Anne of Green Gables because I could always relate to Anne. She has really good intentions and makes a lot of mistakes. And usually they're pretty funny mistakes. And a lot of times she really struggles with the fact that she's not exactly what she wants to be, and she feels like she doesn't measure up to the expectations of those around her. So I really understood her growing up, and I liked her a lot. Now, the story has to do with this older couple of siblings, a brother and sister who are in their late 50s, early 60s in Canada, in like the late 1800s. Now, because they're getting older and they live on a farm, they think to themselves, oh, we need some help. Why don't we adopt an orphan boy and he can help out at the farm? So they send away for an orphan boy, not something you can do anymore. And what turns up instead is Anne Shirley, a 13-year-old redheaded girl who talks a lot and has a big imagination. And these two very plain, very boring older siblings are suddenly faced with, we have an orphan, but it's not the one we were expecting, and it's not what we were hoping to get out of this arrangement. They were hoping to have a person to help them with the farm, and instead they have this young lady who is eager and willing, but instead they decide to have her help them in other ways and send her to school. And she ends up helping them quite a lot, but she also gets into a pretty fair amount of trouble. And she has a very fiery temper, which I always appreciated growing up. She was not afraid to tell other people how she felt. So I always really liked Anne of Green Gables, and it's not one of those books where they're all just sort of sitting around being like, oh yes, this cup of tea, yes, yes, and not really doing anything. There's lots of adventures that Anne goes on and lots of trouble that she gets into. And while all the stories have kind of a moral, like maybe you shouldn't walk on the roof of somebody's house, maybe, it never really felt like preachy to me, like I was being sat in a corner and said things like, oh, behave. It never felt like that to me, so I always appreciated that. The next one is not nearly so lighthearted, and I would, if you want to read this book, I would think deeply about it before you pick this book up if you feel like you're really ready for a book like this. Diary of a Young Girl. For those of you who don't know, this is an autobiographical diary. It was a real diary written by Anne Frank. Anne Frank was a young girl living in Nazi-occupied Denmark in the 1940s during World War II. She was a young Jewish girl, and the Nazis were rounding up and murdering Jewish people. So she and her family were trying to avoid, obviously, they were trying to avoid being rounded up. And so they lived in somebody's attic with another family and I think one other person. So there was about 8 or 9 of them total. And they lived in an attic for 2 years. Never allowed to leave, not allowed to talk or make loud noises during the day. They had no jobs, they had no internet, they had nothing. So it's like quarantine, but 100 times worse. And if anybody had ever found out about them, it would have been a death sentence, essentially. And I don't want to give too much away about the book, but I think that this book gives really good insight into how everybody is the same. Fundamentally, humans are all the same. And it gives a very good perspective into what life is like when you are truly living under oppressive persecution. Sorry, my words aren't coming out today. When you are being genuinely persecuted. When you are genuinely living in a state of oppression and you are being targeted for who you are as a person. And other things that you can't avoid, like your ethnicity or your eye color or your religion. So this is a really intense book, but it's very worth reading. It's just one of those books that you may have to sit and ask yourself before you read it, is this something I really want to read right now? Or is this something that maybe can wait a couple of years down the road? But it's a really excellent book, and everybody should read it at least once during their lifetime. Okay, this one is also really kind of sad, but in a completely different way. I read this book for the first time only a few years ago. It's The Little Prince. It's translated from the French originally. The gentleman who wrote it was a participant in the World Wars, and when he came out of the World Wars, he felt very sad and very distant, and so he wrote this story kind of about himself. He's sort of the pilot in the story, but he's also kind of the little boy, and the story revolves around there's this pilot out in the desert, and he meets this little boy, and this little boy is like, yeah, I'm from a planet really far away, and I've been sort of hopping here and there and seeing which planet I really want to stay on. And so he tells these stories about the different planets he's visited, and foxes and flowers, and it's a very beautiful story, but it's filled with deeper meanings. So this is a book you might want to have some guided notes for, if you can find them, or some other types of explanations to go along with this book, but it is beautifully, beautifully written. It is very moving and profound, and it's really quick. I think I read this in like 2 hours, maybe an hour or two when I first read it. So it's a very quick read, and it's absorbing and engaging and beautifully, beautifully written. So I would definitely recommend this one. But this is also one that you might want to come back to as well in a couple of years, and come back to in a couple of years after that, and come back to in a couple of years after that, because it has so many layers of meaning to dig through. Okay. The last classic I have is Matilda. I always really liked Matilda. For those of you who don't know what Matilda is about a little girl who loves to read. And she's part of a family that does not like to read. They only like to watch television, and they don't really like Matilda because she's so different from them. She likes to read, she does not like television, she's small but she's smart, and they just really don't like her. The rest of her family doesn't like her. And so books are her safe haven, her sanctuary. And because she gets so smart from reading all of these books, she starts to develop these powers where she can move things with her mind. So I like this book because it's about being smart and using those smarts for good. It's about reading. It's about powerful little girls. And it's about making your own family. So I always really liked that. The other thing to keep in mind with Roald Dahl is that every one of Roald Dahl's books has some kind of twist. And usually they're unpleasant. So for example, in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, yeah, Charlie gets to go to the chocolate factory and it's so exciting, but also all of these children are being disposed of, essentially. They are put up against tests found unworthy and are being gotten rid of. Or if you read The Witches by Roald Dahl, his parents, the main character's parents, have been killed in a car accident, and he goes with his grandmother on vacation to this hotel that's completely full of witches. And witches are the people who killed his parents, and then they turn him into a mouse, and everything about it is just slightly horrifying. And Matilda is no exception. There are quite a few horrifying circumstances in Matilda. Like, for example, the fact that she is living essentially with neglectful, abusive parents. The fact that she's there and they're treating her so horribly is very dark and twisted. So this is an excellent read because it is very empowering, but at the same time, there's lots of things about it that sort of get you in your gut a little bit. So I really like Roald Dahl, and I've enjoyed everything that I have read by him, but it's all a little bit twisted. So classics do not need to be dry and dull and boring and filled with, a bunch of people sitting around sipping their tea. Classics can be just as enjoyable as books that you might read today and were published today. Part of it has to do with your attitude. If you go into a book thinking it's going to be boring and you're not going to enjoy it, guess what? You probably won't. But if you go into it thinking, yeah, I'm really going to enjoy this book, I'm so excited to read it, you'll probably enjoy it way more. And that's the attitude I think people should take with classics. I'm going to read this classic book and I'm going to get so much out of it and it's going to be such a fun book. I think we'll all enjoy life a little bit more if that's the mindset that we go through life with. Now the question is, where did this rat baby go? She in here somewhere. The question is where? You gotta say goodbye. Oh, is that you? I did not have to lure her out with a cranberry today. There's my girl. Here's Miss Olive. Miss Olive likes classics too, but she also enjoys a really good contemporary YA novel centered around children with illnesses. This has been Miss Kay and Olive's Favorite Tales.